Now we'll go over to Zambia, where its annual inflation for July 2023 has increased to 10.3% from the 9.8% recorded in June 2023. Now, the Zambia Statistics Agency, ZAMSTAT, says retail prices between July 2022 and July this year shows that national average price of a 25 kilogram of breakfast mealie meal increased by 39.75% from 161.98 Zambian kwacha to 226.37 Zambian kwacha. Now, economic analyst Gianmarco Capati joins me to unpack this. Good afternoon, Gianmarco. Inflation has been easing in Zambia, now back to double digits. How did this happen? What factors contributed to this? Can you unmute your mic, please? Gianmarco, can you hear me? Can you unmute your mic?
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Great. So I was saying inflation has gone back up to double digits, yes, and the July outturn of 10.3% is actually the highest print since April 2022, so just after the start of the war in Ukraine. I think this is the result of a combination of factors, but you're right to point out that food price has been a key driver. So if you look at the data, that 40% jump in the price of meal from a year ago, most of that has happened in the last couple of months, really. So Zambia is estimated to have collected around 3.2 million tons of maize in its main harvest in June. That's still above what's required to meet domestic consumption and therefore to export to neighboring countries. It's not spectacular, and the problem is that bad weather conditions in several parts of the region have pushed up demand for Zambian cereals and prices as well. And that's why the Zambian Food Reserve Agency has raised the price it pays to buy maize from domestic farmers by 50% recently. And that is just to discourage smuggling to other countries, which has been happening since January, especially to the Congo. Now, the rising grain prices on a global level last month after Russia pulled out from its grain deal with Ukraine, that's also partly to blame. But I'd say above all, the appreciation of the kwacha, particularly against the South African rand, really raised the cost of imports.
So you just mentioned the kwacha right now. I would like to know how much impact this rise in inflation has had on foreign investment, and especially in the currency, the kwacha.
I would almost look at it the other way around. So the volatility in foreign investment, especially in the bond markets, has been a key driver of the kwacha's depreciation, which has then fueled inflationary pressures. We have seen a very lengthy debt restructuring process since the country's default in late 2020. Now, an agreement to restructure more than $6 billion in external debt was finally reached with official creditors in June, and that led to a rally in the kwacha that month. Unfortunately, the currency started depreciating again in July. That, to me, signals that this was already priced in by markets and that investors are now closely watching whether the government can also clinch a deal with private creditors, and especially holders of the Eurobonds worth $3 billion. That would be the last stage of the restructuring process and would provide some clarity to investors on the country's debt sustainability, and would obviously then support the kwacha and ease important inflation. In terms of foreign direct investment, we've seen a few new investment announcements by major mining companies in the last couple of years, but this hasn't really led to an increase in mining output and exports yet, which continue to fall as of Q1 of this year. So that's another challenge at the moment that's just limiting gains for the kwacha and keeping inflation higher for longer.
As well, look at these limitations. We've seen the African Development Bank in their latest Southern African Economic Outlook saying that the Zambia inflation is expected to decline to about 8.5% in 2020. That's this year, and 7.1% in 2024. Do you agree with this projection?
At this point, I think the 8.5% forecast for this year is a bit overly optimistic, given the latest jump in inflation in July. So far, it's averaged about 10% this year. Still think it's going to come down quite a bit over the rest of 2023. And one of the reasons is the sell-off of the kwacha in Q4 last year. That's going to provide favorable base effects for inflation. And the second potential reason is a possible deal with private creditors that will offer a further boost to investor confidence and ease pressure on the currency later in the year. Now, having said that, I'm thinking more of an average of 9.5% this year, and only slowing towards that 8.5% by year end. And I think 7% for next year seems realistic, but I would still keep an eye on the food price situation, particularly in the context of the El Nino weather event that could bring more drought to the region and for the reduced food supplies. That's a major, say, risk.
Also keeping an eye on food prices will be the central bank in Zambia. What stance do you see the central bank taking on monetary policy?
So the Bank of Zambia has been tightening monetary policy since February. It hiked the policy rate by 25 basis points in February and again in May. And there's a high chance we'll hike again later this month. But this is not aggressive tightening by any means. And the policy rate is at 9.5%, which is fairly accommodative. Overall, the central bank has retained this dovish bias under the current governor. But I think one of the reasons it hasn't been more aggressive is that inflation is being driven entirely by supply side factors. So tightening financial conditions is not going to help really. And the sentiment-driven depreciation of the kwacha and the rise in regional grain prices are the main factors driving inflation in the country, and they're clearly beyond the control of the central bank. So I think any further tightening will remain largely ineffective, and inflation will eventually come down for other reasons.
Thank you so much, Gianmarco Capati, for sharing your insights on the program.
My pleasure.